Bill in St. Louis, Missouri. Hey, Bill, what's up?
Yeah, fine. Thank you. Yes, Tom, yesterday on your program you mentioned the fourth journey, and then you
No, hang on just a second. It's called The Fourth Turning, Turning. That's the title of the book.
T-O-U-R?
T-U-R, turn, like, to turn left, to turn right, The Fourth Turning.
Okay.
Yeah, by Strauss and Howe.
Okay, and then you also made, you made reference, did you have a conversation with him on your program?
Yes.
Then you made reference to conversation.
The website is called conversationswithgreatminds.com.
And what's his name?
It was Neil Howe, who I had on.
H-O-W-E or something like that?
That's correct.
Okay. And just basically, can you tell me in this real quickly what the book is about?
Yes, I'll give you my nutshell summary that Neil Howe may disagree with. I can't speak for him and his writing partner. I forget his first name, but Mr. Strauss. But it's been a decade since I read the book. Mm-hmm. But here's my recollection of the thesis, and I think this is fairly accurate. Okay. They basically say that there are 4 generations that continuously recur in Western civilization. And just to arbitrarily start at some point, let's start with the generation that experienced the Great Depression and World War II. So there's a generation that experiences a horrible crisis, a depression and a war. Because of the way that they lived through that, because of their experience living through that Great Depression and war, they raise their children in such a way, or the next generation coming up, are the quiet builders, which would be the generation of the 50s and the early 60s, the quiet builders who built the nation. The silent, Nixon's silent majority, the people who don't speak out much, and they're just, put shoulder to the grindstone, incredible work ethic. Now, their children look at them and say, why are you working so hard for material things? It's, because their children grew up with material wealth, not abundant wealth, but, enough, sufficiency, whereas their grandparents hadn't, right? So their children grew up with sufficiency, so they say, we're going to go off and explore spiritual things. We want to go for the transcendent. And so they give birth to a generation that explores the transcendent, whether it's the Emerson Thoreau generation in the 19th century or whether it's the hippies in the 60s and 70s. And then they, because of their experience throwing out the physical and going after the metaphysical, their children look at them and say, well, you guys were crazy. We just need to get everything we can and get as much as we can. Greed is good. So they give birth to a generation, the 4th generation, that just tries to grab as much as it possibly can. And the analogy is the Roaring '20s, the boom and bust cycle, the Roaring '20s, and the '90s and the early 2000s. And then that generation, because of the insanity of their policies, of their libertarianism, their anything goes, laissez-faire economics, I'm just me, generation of greed, they then create bubbles and crash the economy, which brings about a Great Depression, which brings about a war, which starts the cycle all over again. And the 4th turning is that point where that cycle starts all over again, where the depression and the war begins, thus the title of the book. And they point out, they go all the way back to the 1600s, how these 4 generations, and so there's this 80 year, each generation is about 20 years. Jefferson defined a generation as 19 years. I think they use 20 years in the book. So it's roughly 80 years. So what they're saying is, 80 years ago was the Great Depression, and right now we're going to have another one. 80 years before the Great Depression was the Great Depression of the 1860s, which led to the Civil War. 80 years before that was the Great Depression of the 1760s, which led to the 1770s and the Revolutionary War. 80 years before that was the Great Depression of the 1680s, which led to the first major colonization and fairly revolutionary activities in the United States, and also in the UK. I think it was the War of the Roses or something like that. 80 years before that, in like 1610, that was the first colonization. Blah blah. And every generation has its own archetype. Every generation has its own hero. Each of these 4 generations, every generation has its own particular challenges, and they've got these charts and graphs that lay it all out. It's absolutely fascinating. And in 1979. Which is the copyright date on this book. They actually wrote it. It took them several years to write it. So they were writing it in 94, 95, 96. And this is what Neil Howe talks about in my half-hour conversation with him that you'll find over at conversationswithgreatminds.com. He says, back in the 90s, they were predicting that roughly about now, there would be and they wrote this in the book. You can find it in the book, page 273. We had a caller yesterday who was reading to us from the book. In the book, they wrote that, about now there would be a crisis caused by the debt ceiling. Actually, they said there are 4 possible triggers. This was one of those 4. It would be a crisis caused by the Republicans refusing to raise the debt ceiling, forcing a Democratic president to do it unilaterally, which then causes the Republicans to try to impeach him, which produces a constitutional crisis, which then brings about a crash in the stock markets, which then brings about a worldwide Great Depression, which then causes war, and bingo, we're back to the 1930s all over again. And then out of that war comes a Franklin Delano Roosevelt figure. I mean, historically, that's how it's worked for us in the West. And out of that war comes a transformational figure who rebuilds the country. Right now, the one thing to remember that is my cautionary note on all this is that the last fourth turning was the 1930s, right? And we're all clear on that. Right. That was the last crisis in war. We had FDR, and we know the direction that the United States went. We built a pluralistic society. We ended segregation. We gave women the right to vote, blah, 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 blah. Germany had Hitler, and they went in a very different direction from us out of that exact same experience of that fourth turning. And so leadership matters. It matters who is the president at the time that the fourth turning happens. It matters who's in charge of Congress at the time the fourth turning happens. And that's one of the reasons that I'm so concerned about these right-wing crazies spewing hatred of Muslims and Islamophobia and, with these crazy economic theories is, we need to remember, we had FDR, thank God. Germany had Hitler, and they're still paying the price for it. And we've got to be very, very careful about our leadership, and it's why we need to all be involved in politics. Bill, thanks for the call. Great to hear from you. We'll be back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.